Chris is an assistant professor at the Harris School. His research interests are in the political economy of American local government and the politics of federal spending. He's currently engaged in two major lines of research. One explores the design of how the design of local government influences policy and political accountability. The second looks at ways in which politics between the branches of government influence the way federal money is distributed. He's got a BA from Vassar, his master's is from Cornell, and a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's program on education policy and governance. His community development work includes service at the Metro Edge division of Shorebank, where Bob also spent a good deal of time, and his book, Imperfect Union, Representation and Taxation in Multi-Level Governments, takes an in-depth look at the costs and challenges of overlapping jurisdictions in government. Chris.
Well, I think after Ed's talk, I really just couldn't bear to sit down and talk from the chair. So if you all found Paula's talk a bit depressing, you should probably leave now. There's still time. Because what I'm going to say is that the problems of the city of Chicago itself, which she documented well, are really just one layer of the problems that are confronting us as a city. Really, the place that we know of, Chicago, is governed by many different overlapping jurisdictions. And just to give you a list of those that are operating, levying taxes in the city of Chicago, we've got, well, of course, the city itself, the Board of Education, Cook County, the Water Reclamation District, the Park District, Forest Preserve District, the city colleges, the Chicago School Building and Improvement Fund, and depending where you live in the city, you might also pay taxes to the South Cook County Mosquito Abatement District. Now, each of these governments is facing the same problems that the city of Chicago is. Different in particulars here and there, but the same fundamental problems of the structural and cyclical issues in the budget and how to balance them. And in the city itself, the average person, the average property owner is paying taxes to somewhere between 7 and 15 different layers of government, okay, each with these problems. That's just in the city of itself. If we were to look at Cook County more broadly, there are about 500 different local government entities that are levying taxes and therefore trying to balance a budget as well. Why is this important? Because each of these overlapping jurisdictions that's taxing the same area is relying on the same tax base in order to pay back, in order to draw out its revenue. So when one of them tries to balance its budget by increasing its revenue in some way, it can actually dig the other ones into a deeper hole. Why? Because we know that taxes are distortionary. That is, when you raise the tax rate, some aspect of the tax base is going to be diminished by people fleeing that taxation. So prime example recently is Cook County's sort of attempts to raise the sales tax. Very big increase in the sales tax by the county government itself, making us the highest sales tax area in the country. Surely some amount of taxable activity is going to leave the county as a result of that. I don't think we have good empirical estimates yet of how much, but we know it's some. So somebody at the margin is saying, well, it's worth it now to me to move over to the next county and buy some big purchase rather than doing it here in Cook County. Well, here's the problem. There were 4 other governments that also were part of that sales tax. Okay, they're all, when you pay that 10.25 or 9.75% sales tax, that's not all going to one government. There's 5 of them that are counting on that. And now that activity that's gone somewhere else, well, what are those 4 other governments going to do with their budget? They were counting on that money. Now their budget hole is deeper. Okay? And it's not just a local government phenomenon. Think about what's going on at the state level now. We've got the state of Illinois that's going to raise our income taxes. I shouldn't even say going to anymore. Just raise the income taxes, notably. For sure, again, we're going to see some jobs flee the state as a result of that. And all the local governments were counting on that tax base for their budget. So we've got this intertwining of all of the respective tax bases, and yet a bunch of governments that are making independent decisions from each other. And massive numbers of them, unlike anywhere else in the country. And yet, this is what we call in economics a common pool problem. Now, this problem dates back a long time. Aristotle recognized it when he said, what is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. And in Cook County, we have a tax base that is common to the greatest number in the country. And we worry about who's bestowing care upon it, if anyone. The most familiar example here of what's called an overfishing or tragedy of the commons problem comes from fisheries, where the concern is you've got a bunch of different fishermen independently out roaming the ocean trying to catch fish. Someone says, well, you don't want to catch too many fish today because then you may deplete the stock. the population of fish. There won't be any fish to catch tomorrow. And, well, as a crew, the fishermen may recognize their longevity over the long haul. It requires them to be moderate today. Any given fisherman says, gee, but I get all the benefits of the extra fish I catch today if I overfish, and these problems are going to be spread out over everybody else in the future. And we have the same problem now, where when Cook County decides it should raise the sales tax in order to balance its budget, let's put aside the question of whether they actually needed the money or not. That's beside the point. The fact is the cost of that, the costs that are going to come home to roost when taxable activity goes away, is borne by all these other governments. Now, I haven't even talked about TIFs. Paula alluded to TIFs. Now, TIFs are not independently taxing governments, but they do draw revenue from property taxation. There are 150 TIFs in Chicago, 400 in Cook County. And if you were to count all the different taxing agencies in Cook County, including TIFs and other kinds of special agencies, you've got about 1,500 separate taxing agencies that overlap each other in about 3,000 unique different patterns. I'll say that again. About 1,500 different taxing agencies that overlap in about 3,000 unique patterns, which is to say there are 3,000 different tax rates, different combinations of overlapping governments in our one county. Now, the reason I say about 3,000 instead of giving you an exact number is because the spreadsheet that's printed that lists each of these combinations of tax districts is itself 150 pages long, and I got tired of counting them one by one, so I guesstimated. It's in the neighborhood of 3,000. And this brings me to the second big problem. It's not just fiscal, it is political. And what we have is a lack of transparency. Where does the buck stop when you've got 1,500 taxing agencies, 3,000 possible combinations of tax rates that you might pay? It's hard for citizens to figure out where their money is going, who's spending it, and what they should be expecting in return. I would suggest that even in this room of people who, by virtue of being here, I guess, have great interest in the city, are highly educated and informed about politics, I would guess there's not more than a handful of people in this room that can say with certainty which governments they're actually paying taxes to. And that's really tragic. And it leads to an interest group problem. Each of these governments has some group that cares very passionately about what it does. There are its own employees, and there are the beneficiaries of what it does. Cook County provides health. Most of its budget goes into health care. We've got water reclamation, we've got parks, we've got libraries. There are people who care a lot about each of these things, but there's no one in a central position of central authority to make the trade-offs between them. So if all you do is parks, you think parks are the most important thing. If all you do is health or schools, those are the most important things to you, and you've got a constituency of people who share that view too. And there's no one making these trade-offs. Well, we're running a $650 million deficit just at the city level. It's much more when you add this across all these jurisdictions. Who's to say, well, do we need to be cutting here or there, and what are the trade-offs? We don't have anyone in that position. We've got a bunch of interest groups that are promoting spending on particular areas. So what do we do about it? Well, so one typical response you see to situations like this is someone will say, well, we need some form of consolidation. We should just have one big government. Okay? And this has happened. You see, Miami, there was a bunch of consolidation. Indianapolis with the Unigov. Efforts to just really consolidate everything into one big jurisdiction. That's not the right approach either. There are benefits to be had from competition. We want, and Ed Glazer alluded to this, we want people to be able to move around and the governments to feel a threat that if they're not being efficient in delivering services well, that people might move elsewhere. Whether it's the competition between the city and the suburbs, the competition between one suburb or another, it's healthy and it's beneficial. Of course, the problem is that the governments that are vertically overlapping on top of each other are not competing with each other. Okay? The Water Reclamation District is not competing with the city. The school district is not competing with the city. Okay? There's no competition in that sort of multiplication of jurisdiction. So an institutional reform that would make sense is not consolidating all the governments into one giant government that faces no competitors, but rather maybe taking away some tax authority from all these 1,500 different agencies or 400 independently taxing governments in Cook County, having a central tax authority where each individual government may be able to spend money, right, but not to independently raise and change taxes. Now, this is a radical idea. Any of you who have followed politics of recently, or particularly the politics of trying to get rid of the Cook County Tuberculosis Sanitarium District, which many of you may not know we had, but I suspect most of you were paying taxes to until a few years ago. It's nasty to get rid of one of these things. It took many years to get rid of the Tuberculosis Sanitarium District, despite the fact that you might have thought the need for a tuberculosis district was, say, less pressing now than it might have been, in 1949 when it was formed. But it continued on levying taxes and amassing massive surpluses until it was eliminated a couple of years ago, and it was really difficult. It took a special act of the state legislature. So the problem, the solution I just suggested of removing tax authority from each jurisdiction, have a central taxing board that then disperses the money out is, to be honest, not entirely practical, but as Ed Glazer told us, the duty of academics is to say radical things. But I think in the short run, absent some state action, that's not going to happen. What we are going to need, though, is a strong mayor. Again, another theme from Ed's speech is city leadership requires someone in a strong position of authority. That strength may come from the institutional design, the actual powers that inhere in the mayor. It may come from personality and political will. I think we've benefited a lot from having Mayor Daley here for the last 20 years, who has been a person who has that sort of power, and I think has probably prevented the problems from being worse. But if each of these governments becomes an independent fiefdom of somebody different, we're going to be in real trouble. And so I think that's one of the things we're going to need to look for from our next mayor. More practically speaking, how would the mayor do this? How would all these different governments cooperate and work with the private sector? That's a hard question. Luckily, Bob Weissbourd has the answers, and he's next. So.
I'm not clapping.
Thanks, Chris. Let me ask just a quick follow-up of you. You talk about how this paradox in which we have these institutions such as the tuberculosis sanitarium district, which exists long after the disease has all been eradicated here. And yet the interest of those people in the district itself, the employees thereof, et cetera, is to maintain their jobs, maintain the entity itself. What incentives are available to the state or whatever local authorities to create an incentive by which some of these outdated or outmoded institutions might actually put themselves out of business? Is there any way to provide an incentive for them to do so?
There aren't a lot of incentives in place now, and if you look at the history of the tuberculosis sanitarium district, I mean, the problem is a common one, which is the average person was paying something like $2 or $3 a year in taxes to the tuberculosis sanitarium district, which, when you average that up over millions of people, is a lot of money. But any individual person, were they to say, should I really become politically active and take on this cause in order to save my $3, is probably going to conclude no. And this problem is multiplied over and over again, and this is why I was referring to the nature of the interest group problem. There are some people that get quite a lot of benefits from the existence of the district, and for them it is worth becoming politically mobilized to protect it, but for most of the rest of us it's not worth becoming politically mobilized to do something about it. And that particular example was one where a good government group, a civic federation, was able to work long and hard over the course of many years and get the states to do something about it. But it's one of the problems is most of the enabling legislation for these sort of jurisdictions says how they can be created and says absolutely nothing about how they can be removed or eliminated. Thereby, it requires a special act of the legislature to do it, and it's just thorny.
Would there be the opportunity to create kind of an omnibus sunset provision that would affect all of these, number of these taxing bodies?
We are not one of them, but there are states in which the enabling legislation requires a vote every so often of the constituent or taxpayers of the district to keep it in existence. And a solution like, a change like that to Illinois, I think would be quite productive.
Okay, thank you.
Would have to come from Springfield.